Aperture.
Hi, thanks for everyone for coming out tonight, and sorry if you were planning on coming a couple of weeks ago when Lucas was originally scheduled to speak here, but he had a dental problem that prevented him from speaking that night, but we're happy that he is feeling better and is here with us tonight. I'm Michael Famagetti, I'm the editor of Aperture Magazine, and tonight's program is sponsored by Aperture Foundation in collaboration with the Department of Photography at Parsons The New School for Design. And we're very excited to have Lucas here tonight. Lucas is a real friend of Aperture. His work has been featured in our magazine, and it will soon be featured in a forthcoming book by Charlotte Cotton called Photography is Magic that we're publishing this fall. And if you've been to the newsstand recently, you may have seen the recent edition of Freeze magazine, which features a photo by Lucas on the cover. It's a beguiling composition of neatly arranged hot dogs gracing the cover. The accompanying article was written by curator Brian Scholas, who in the piece locates Lucas among his artist peers, who are likewise grappling with the dramatic shifts that have occurred in image making over the last decade. And Scholas in his piece provides a useful gist of Lucas's practice. He writes, Blalock has exhibited and published a large body of strange and strangely compelling photographs, still lives mostly, but also portraits and semi-abstract compositions that encourage viewers simultaneously to decode what is being depicted and to ruminate on how that depiction is constructed. Also, a couple of years back, Lucas interviewed Jeff Wall for us, and I loved it. At one point in the interview, Wall commented, Lucas was interviewing Wall, but Wall commented back on Lucas's photographs and observed that they displayed a certain angst, in part because of their, quote, rough handling of the digital information. And though Blalock's photographs may display some angst and seriously grapple with the mechanics of depiction, the images, to me, are also refreshingly playful, and in part because of how they display his a witty sense of humor. Blalock attended Bard College, the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture, and the University of California, Los Angeles. He has exhibited at venues including the Dallas Museum of Art, the Contemporary Arts Museum Houston, and MoMA PS1. He recently had solo exhibitions at Ramekin Crucible here in New York and White Flag Projects in St. Louis, and has an upcoming exhibition at Gallery Rudolf Janssen in Brussels. His work has been featured in publications including the New York Times, the New Yorker, Art in America, Aperture, Freeze, Moose, Monopole, and Foam. His books include Inside the White Cube, published in 2014, and a self-published Be Happy Book Club Volume 7, also published in 2014. He lives and works in Brooklyn, and we're excited to have him here tonight to talk about his work. So join me in welcoming Lucas Blalock.
Hi, thank you for coming. And thank you, Michael, for the introduction. Cool. So I want to begin with this picture, the talk tonight. This is a picture called Picture for Mark from 2012. And I sort of want to begin with the idea that if this picture were a painting, it would be strange to ask what had happened to it. You know, that a painting is really a picture that's made with an accumulation of marks or accumulation of decisions on a plane. But because this thing is a photograph, there's like a naturalism that we expect of it. And in the activity that's going on in this picture is really interrupting that naturalism. And I feel like what is happening in this picture is basically it's a still life photograph of a number of objects on a plywood table, and all of the objects have been removed using the clone stamp, which is a tool in Photoshop that you can use to sample one part of an image and put it over another part. And I think that this distance between something being natural and something being the way we end up seeing it is something that has become really central to my work. And I started asking questions in a picture like this about whether these objects have been sort of removed, whether they've been erased, or whether they've been covered up, whether this activity that I'm going through using this tool is additive or subtractive. And in sort of the answer in some ways has been that it's both, that depending on the other sort of contextual clues within the picture, you can sort of see it either way. And that's, that's something that I'm sort of trying to unpack and explore as I'm making these works. And I sort of also get myself comfortable up here. I sort of also wanted to ask whether this thing is still a photograph. And whether if I'd done this activity more seamlessly, if it would be more of a photograph. And if that was true, then what that says about photography. And so I want to start off by claiming to be a photographer. And for me, this is more than just sort of claiming that I make my pictures starting with a camera. It's sort of thinking about photography as a historical activity, as a thing that I'm continuing. And photography as a field has given me a way to think about the sort of activities in my work and in my picture making against a ground, that it's given a kind of setting or backbone for the kinds of things that I wanted to play with. And I was really interested in how the historical conditions of photography might sort of be at home in the world today, in the world of the internet, in the world of digital photography and these kinds of things. That there was a part that was being added that was new. There was a part that was coming from what was going on contemporaneously, but that there was also like a tradition that was being sort of dragged with me or brought forward. And I really see photography as a sort of shared construction, sort of continuing on from this idea that it's like it's more like it's less an ontological question. It's less a question of light on paper or some other sort of essential quality, and more something like a language or like English, where it's a set of conventions that we all sort of share, and that as they sort of that they're not totally stable, that as they sort of move and bob, that we sort of move with them. And I feel like photography is this kind of situation. It's sort of it's more of a language than it is an essential thing. And in the next hour, I'm going to talk quite a bit about picture making. And in different modes, this is sort of how I've seen my work since the beginning. And when I say picture making, it's a loose term that could mean a lot of different things. But for me, it's really not a sort of hermetic activity or an expression or necessarily a capture either. But it's really sort of a condition of trying to make a picture of something that is both sort of like takes in the world through the front, that is of the world, but that also is sort of aware of and trying to handle the conditions through which I'm looking. And as I go sort of talk about the work coming, I'll also sort of talk quite a bit about the studio and the way that the studio as a condition has been something that has, me entertaining myself in this room has become one of the real principal sort of forces that has driven the work. And I'll also talk about models quite a bit. And these are models that have sort of worked in the background of my practice. And they've sort of come from photography itself and from cinema and literature and a number of other places. And I think that the way that I tell the story, there's a sense that one is sort of replacing the next. But I think the truth is that they don't really replace each other, that it's been more of an accumulation of spaces over time, and that one may sort of end up in front or being a sort of primary articulator for a while, but it all stays in there. All right, so I sort of want to go back to the beginning. This is a picture I made when I was studying at Bard in the late 90s. This is a photograph of me as Janet Leigh from Psycho in the shower scene. So when I started making pictures, it was in the late 90s. I'm from North Carolina originally and had gone to college thinking I'd be a writer. And when I got there, I was interested in writing and I was interested in movies. And BART had a wonderful photo program, and I started to be interested in the things that were going on over there. And eventually, by about halfway through undergrad, started to make pictures. And I think when I started to make photographs, partially because of where I was coming from, wanting to be a writer and sort of wanting to tell stories at the time, I really thought about photographs as really short films, which might be super obvious. And I think that sense of photography as a really short film, or as like a cinematic moment, was something at that point in time that was really pervasive in the medium. You know, like this was something that was going on a lot in work by Jeff Wall or Cindy Sherman or Gregory Crutzen. And it felt, I think, like a really easy fit, you know, like it felt like a way that I could make stuff. And I think it's sort of telling, thinking back to this moment, about the sort of where photography was then. And I feel like the thing that I always think about is that at this point, I mean, even up into the 2000s, the question about how a photograph was made was much more one about whether it had been staged or whether it was documentary, as opposed to whether it had been manipulated. And I feel like the story of my work in some ways has been sort of transversing that ground into the one that really has much more to do with manipulation than any kind of staging. And it's sort of worth saying also that at this point, you know, all of the sort of activity of photography, like all of the sort of creative activity of photography, all the ways that I was thinking about being an artist, when I was thinking through those modes, was really sort of in front of the lens. You know, that everything that could be sort of played with or toyed with was out in front, and that the camera was a pretty sort of seamless recorder. And I think that as time went on, that became the thing that sort of shifted the most for me, or had the most pressure put on it. And so there were two photographers early on who were really, really influential for me. This is a picture by Stephen Shore, who ran the program at Bard. And his pictures and his sense of what it means to make a photograph are something that I'm still thinking about a lot. It's a picture by Jeff Wall, another photographer who I found in my sort of late teen years, and who, you know, also has sort of a sort of story around his own picture making that I think made a huge impact on me. And I think it's important to say that through these two photographers, I sort of found also two parallel histories of photography. And through Stephen, I, you know, was really introduced to this sort of Walker Evans Atche history of photography. And through Jeff, I think I was introduced to artists like Dan Graham and conceptualism and these kinds of turns, and to sort of instigated to try to think about painting, which I feel like these are two things that are still sort of like really going on in my work. Neither one of these trajectories feels like it's sort of died. But I think I was sort of trying to make work that sort of navigated this terrain and was sort of bouncing off of new topographics and sort of bouncing off of this sort of stage narrative idea. And by like 2006 or 2007, I'd really sort of run aground. Like I really didn't know where the work was going to go. And I sort of got out of it in a really, in a way I wouldn't have expected. All right, so the next sort of part of the talk, I want to talk about these three influences that it really ended up shaping the work that came after them. And it's Moby Dick on the left, and that's Godard on the top, and Bertolt Brecht below. And I'll sort of talk about them one at a time. But so in this picture by Gustave Le Gray. But in early 2007, I read Moby Dick. And I was at the time like really didn't have a sense that I was going to I knew where my work was going or why I was going to continue making photographs. I'd sort of found photography as a sort of pictorial antidote. Like, I wasn't trained at all in art, so photography was something that was really accessible to me coming from this sort of very much more writerly background. And, you know, I'd really been exploring it up until this point through the ways that it had been used after the Second World War. You know, like I was really thinking about photography through art and through the ways that it had been sort of very self-consciously made as art. And I didn't really feel a lot of connection to the first 100 years of the medium. And when I read Moby Dick, I sort of had this epiphany that really, I felt very close all of a sudden to this author who had written this book in 1853. And the sort of like intelligence and humor and strangeness of that book really sort of expanded my sense of space and time. And it was, you know, probably fortuitous for me that you know, Moby Dick was sort of written at the same moment that photography is sort of invented. And so these two things sort of got to work in parallel for me. And I started to get really interested in the second half of the 19th century and the kinds of culture and the kinds of lessons that were sort of available from that place. And I started to think about how so many of the models for the world we live in now were really invented then. You know, it was the time of the Industrial Revolution, and there was this sort of the construction of the modern idea of the self. It sort of shows up in both Marx and in Freud. And there's really like the birth of the city in its sort of grandeur really happens at that point. And you know, there's a sort of reframing about time and space. And you know, not least of all of these things is that the photograph gets invented, and that this tool ends up really sort of framing a lot of what comes after it. And, you know, it's also was this age of sort of tremendously high anxiety. And there was all this innovation, but it was also putting a lot of pressure on people on their selfhood, on the way that they were sitting in the world. And it was really interesting to me in 2007, reading this book, to sort of see a real parallel between that moment and some of the things that were going on in the digital. You know, in the 1870s, there was sort of like one of the great specters of the new city was the confidence man. It was this person who would take you into his confidence and then sort of take advantage of you one way or the other. And in 2007, it was like, you know, the great moment of identity theft. So it was there was a way in which all of this older information felt a lot more available to me than it might have at another moment. So the other two things quickly that really sort of, I think, laid the foundation for the work that came after. This is Godard. And I was really attracted to Godard because I think, for one, because he was making films on a super small scale, you know, like it was like 3 people in an apartment making a movie. And at the time, it was photography felt much more in the scale of somebody like Gursky or Jeff Wall, and felt like these sort of big fantastical productions. And I think as a young artist, it was really hard to see how one might approach that. And so Godard sort of gave me a way to think about going forward. And he was also making these movies by sort of borrowing conventional plot structures and then interrupting them. And he most famously does this with the jump cut, but he also did it with sort of asides and gags that were sort of all throughout his films. And I think that activity, this idea that you could take something that was already in existence or that already had a formula and cut it up and play with it was really exciting to me. Oops. Okay, so these are some of the pictures I was looking at. This is a multigraph from the late 19th century. This is Sinache. It's the Man Ray. It's Paul Outerbridge. Steichen. It's Brancusi. And so I'm sort of showing these pictures because my way into thinking through the 19th century was really just to metabolize the history of photography. Like when I sort of realized that this is something that might be, it might have some resonance to the kind of ways that I was thinking, that I was sort of continuing a tradition of making these kinds of things, that sort of exploring the kinds of decisions other artists had made became sort of the first step to me sort of reopening how I might approach. And so these are some of the works that I was making. So while I was making this work, I was thinking a lot about how to make something strange or how to get it to act up. And I was working through these sort of conventions of the history of photography, but at the same time, I was really interested in trying to get the world to feel responsive, and it turned out that I really wasn't surrounded by all of the sort of nice objects of modernist photography, that I really was surrounded by a bunch of cheap plastic stuff. And I sort of started off making pictures of these cheap plastic objects because they were available. And I think in the very beginning, I felt like I was practicing. I was sort of like just going through the motions and understanding how to use the studio and understanding how to use the view camera on a tabletop and these kinds of things. And then when I started to get the negatives back, I realized that lavishing this kind of attention on these kinds of like really poorly made objects was actually, that there was something to that had a sort of character and quality that was exciting. And I think that for me at that point, the work really sort of turned towards that activity. And this is a book that came out in 2009 that I think is really the sort of end of the first period of this work. It's called Towards Warm Math, and it was published by Hasla Books. And looking back on it now, it really feels like a sort of a love letter to the history of photography. Like it's sort of like modernism remade through cheap objects and digital intervention. But at the time, I was thinking a lot about these objects and a lot about the relationships between the camera and these objects. And I started thinking a lot about the way that the photograph names, and in the way that it sort of cuts the world into parts or units, and that this is sort of part of the camera's sort of taxonomic quality. And I started to think about how a picture might undermine this naming, like how it is that you could make a picture of an orange that somehow wouldn't exactly quite act like a picture of an orange, that you could get it to feel off, or to get the name to feel less than enough. And I started to think about this through these metaphors of sort of hedging or babbling or stuttering. And the warm math is sort of another sort of articulation of that same thing. Warm math is this idea that math is a way to cut the world into parts. It's like it works, but it's actually abstract. Like math doesn't need the world to make those parts out of. Where photography is not really like that. Like its most powerful quality is in its relationalness. And so the warm math is the sort of like, it's a way of breaking the world into parts or into quantities that can be added together or spliced back together. But that what's really important about that activity is that it's got, that it's carrying the world with it. And I should say that that everything I just said is sort of what I meant, but that really for me, coming from this writing background, it had really started off from a narrative place. So for me, I was looking and thinking about naming and thinking about math for a structure that would replace narrative. That telling stories with pictures wasn't really what I felt like I was doing anymore, and so I was looking for another way to think about that. And so the third part of this, so it's if Moby Dick gave me sort of the ground and gave me a way to re-engage with photography and see its importance in sort of a cultural vehicle, and Godard sort of encouraged this kind of play, then I think reading Brecht, who I found through Godard, really got me to think about what the tools I was using were. And I think maybe most importantly was Photoshop. And when I was making this work, I was working in my apartment, in my living room, and was really, would come home from work and would put up a backdrop and would set up some lights and had this super theatrical setup that I was sort of performing day after day after day. And I think that reading a playwright at the time made sense because of this. It was like there was an easy way to connect those dots. And in Brecht's theater, he talks a lot about bringing the labor of the production out onto the stage. That labor shouldn't be something that sort of gets melted into the final product. That it's something that should be visible and really a part of what you're interacting with. And I started to think a lot about the way that I think up until this point I had thought about Photoshop as basically just like a surrogate darkroom, it was a thing that I was using because I didn't have access to a darkroom. And I think reading Brecht and thinking through his ideas about theater and staging, I really started to think about it as a thing that had a grammar of its own. And so I started to think about my pictures as being made with these tools. So these are some of the pictures that started to come out of this process. And these are all from 2010. And I should say that, I think a lot of artists who talk about Brecht end up talking about him in a really didactic way, and he's definitely got this part of his tradition. But for me, it really, I think finding him through Godard sort of opened it to something that was more like a burlesque or like a slapstick, and that wasn't as text heavy, that really still sort of ended up believing in the image. So that is one way to tell this story of what sort of happened for me between 2006 and 2009. But there's sort of another one, and this image is what you get if you Google digital age, which is ridiculous. But I think that somewhere along the same. Somewhere along the same time, I think that the digital age did actually sort of catch up to photography. So I was reading these things, and I think in my personal life, it really felt like these were the things that were motivating my work. But I think there was something happening on a bigger stage that I was also sort of involved with in thinking about. And I feel like it was during this period that we really switched models. We went from being in an analog model that had some digital possibilities to being in a digital model, and you could still make the choice to make an analog picture. And I think one of the things that really ended up happening as artist at that moment was all of a sudden you had to sort of self-consciously make the decision to make a picture on a piece of paper. That before then, all photographs, in order for a thing to be a photograph, you had to print it. You had to make it an object. And all of a sudden, we were in a moment where that was sort of an extra step. And I think that this had really sort of huge implications for where photography went right thereafter. And this is a artwork on the slideshow called "Picture Made by My Hand with the Assistance of Light" by Walid Beshti. And I feel like he was an artist who really sort of came onto the stage in this moment. And I think one of the things that happened with this need to make the choice to make a print was that the conversation around photography really went from one that was about picture making, which I think, as I was saying earlier, had sort of existed in the cinematic mode, to being one that was about object making. And that really sort of moved the terms that the medium was sitting in. And I think that there were sort of, by 2007, there were sort of two photographies. There was this sort of very object-determined photography, which, concrete photography. There was a lot of abstraction. There was a lot of sort of conversation about object making. And it was making this kind of work. And then on the other side, you had this photography, which was the image, and Google Image shows up in 2006, and all of a sudden there's a totally disembodied image photography. And for me, there was sort of it's sort of a neither nor, It's like I was really interested in a lot of the work that people were making in terms of thinking about the paper, thinking about what was essentially photography, thinking about those kinds of things. I mean, I was excited about a lot of that work, but it wasn't sort of what I wanted to do. I was still really interested in picture making, which was the thing that most attracted me to photography to begin with. And on the other end, I was really excited about the sort of plasticity of the image, that these things were so, I don't know, that you could have all of these apples, and that all of a sudden a picture was a version of another picture, and that the grammar around photography was changing so much. But I also wasn't really interested in something being, in some ways the image is more like a text, it's it carries the information through the system. It doesn't really do a lot of the things that a picture might, which slow you down, get you to pay attention to the world, those kinds of things. They're not sort of essential to images. And so I think I sort of emerged from these two things looking for a third way. And, I think sort of having to contend with concrete photography and the ideas that were around it, I started to sort of to look for models to sort of metabolize that energy. How can I think through these questions and ideas and still be making photographs with a camera? And as much as I was relying on Brecht's ideas of the epic, I really ended up also thinking a ton about painting. And I think painting was a particularly easy taker because about 100 years before this moment, it was going through a very sort of similar object picture crisis. And I'm going to let these really weird Magritte paintings stand in for painting more generally. But I owe a lot to a lot of painters. And I think that, this is another one. These are these amazing Magritte paintings that he made in 1948 to spite a dealer in Paris who had passed over him. And he spent 5 weeks and made a lot, over 100 paintings. And he just wanted to make the worst paintings he could possibly make so he could give this guy a show of them. But yeah, I got really excited about the way that painting, Magritte being sort of a burlesque at this point in a way, but the painters thought about painting as a thing to fight against, as a condition that could be pushed on. And I think that, there's a book Deleuze wrote about Francis Bacon where he talks about how it's a misnomer that the painter starts with a blank canvas, that actually the painter starts with a canvas that's full of all of the cliches and all of the history of painting. And I guess I sort of started to think about photography like this. I started to wonder if it could be sort of like explored and mined and pushed on in these kinds of ways. And at what point it was still interesting to call something a photograph. And I started to think about photography as a tennis partner or sort of as an opponent. And I started to really sort of take the ideas I'd gotten from thinking about convention in Brecht and Godard and really take them to a really idiosyncratic place. And I also started making my pictures in a really different way. I started working, instead of sort of coming up with ideas or sort of setting a stage and knowing what I was doing when I went in, I started to work the way someone might paint, I guess. Like, I started to make decisions. I started to give myself hours to work. And so I would just go to the studio and I would sort of set to work. And for me, this related not really to being a painter because I've never been one, but to like practicing sports when I was a kid, like shooting free throws. And it felt like something that there was a really different energy if I wasn't naming what I was doing before I started doing it. And I think the best way for me to show what that looks like is with this book, which is sort of a studio notebook of about 18 months of work that starts in May of 2011 and goes until the first of the year 2013. And it incorporates a period of time when I went to graduate school. I went to UCLA for graduate school and had gone to Skowhegan just before. And I was sort of finishing up school, and it was a moment in my life when it felt like a nice time to sum something up. And so I went online and I made the biggest blurb book you can make. It's just the biggest template they would allow, and which is 240 pages. And so I sort of took all the JPEGs from 18 months and started to organize them into something initially just for me to really think about. And then about a year after I made the initial sort of dummy copy, the book was actually published by Morel Books. But I'm going to show it, and I'm just going to show it really fast. It's a lot of pictures, just really quick. That was Windows Mirrors Tabletops. And this is a slide for an idea that I started talking about while I was making that work, which is the assisted camera. And I started talking about my work being made with this apparatus called the assisted camera. And what I meant by that was that it felt like it's a description of the 4x5 and Photoshop for me. But I just really believe that when we're in the contemporary moment, when we are talking about a photograph, that we're talking about a picture that's being made with some pairing like this. You know, that there's at this point, photography assumes both a tool for capture and a tool for adjustment. You know, and I think that this can be iPhone and Instagram. You know, but it's but the sort of the firm borders that used to suggest like a single state in photography are sort of gone. And it's not to say at all that you can't make an unmanipulated picture, but there were a short time ago, you know, where a picture used to be sort of an impression on film and a very discrete thing, that now it's sort of, that the very nature of photography is very full of this sort of malleability. And from there, I think I want to show a couple of projects that I've been working on recently, and just to talk about some of the thinking that has been going on behind those projects. So I think coming out of this sort of really work all the time kind of mode, which is sort of not totally ceased, but I started to think about the tools I was using in somewhat different ways. And I started to think about the camera and the computer as tools in sort of a more classical sense. Like, and I mean that by like a tool is an extension of the body, in the way that, you know, a shovel is an extension of the arm. And for me, the camera wasn't, as I might have first sort of thought about it, an extension of my eye, but actually sort of more of an extension of my hand. And I started to think about about making photographs as an act of drawing or copying the world. And I started to think a lot about why it is that we make copies, you know, and also a lot about what it means for something to be a good copy, you know, like, is verisimilitude really always sort of the goal of copying? And while I was sort of thinking about these things, or as I was getting into thinking about these things, I read a book by the anthropologist Michael Taussig called Mimesis and Alterity, and he sort of describes copying in this really beautiful way in that book. And he talks about it as a desire to draw something like literally into your hand. You know, that drawing is a way of taking things that are sort of beyond our control and bringing them into our sphere of influence and possession. And I think, and actually, got it in my notes, but Kaja Silverman has just released a book about photography called The Miracle of Analogy, where she makes some of the same arguments about photography. And I think that in an earlier moment, this copying would really be in the realm of drawing. You know, to draw something into your hand was this sort of very manual thing. But to me, I really see photography, or at least seeing photography as a tool of this kind of relationalness, of this kind of touching, was felt like it was opening doors in the practice that I was having, and it felt like something that wasn't discontiguous, like that had continuity with earlier descriptions and earlier sort of thoughts about photography. And I think, so for me, it's like this drawing sort of ended up having a kind of double register. You know, it's like on one side the drawing I was thinking about was about drawing the world. You know, it's like what makes a good picture of a sponge, you know, and that relationship and activity was something that I was interested in. But then I also started to get really interested in this sort of other register of drawing, which is thinking about drawing the unfamiliar space of the digital, you know, and sort of the way I opened the talk tonight about talking about the clone stamp. It's like these things have really ambiguous signifiers. And the space in a photograph at this point is really ambiguous. You know, you can sort of stack things forward in them, and they will sort of hold it, you know, behind their material surface, or you can really sort of vacate them. I guess all I'm saying is that it's hard to locate exactly where the boundaries are. And so I started to get interested in thinking about trying to draw that space, to think about sort of both drawing these spaces on top of each other sort of simultaneously. And you know, I think it's really that thought has been really important to me because it's really changed the terms that I was thinking about making pictures through. And it's instead of thinking about photography, which is sort of how I had been thinking about it as a kind of, or my photography as a kind of burlesque of the commercial studio, you know, where I would sort of do the same procedural things that a commercial photographer would do, except in mine you could see it. You know, I started to think about it more as a sort of limit that I was sort of trying to overcome the mediation of the tools. You know, that I was sort of trying to push on the threshold or on the membrane of photography. And you know, I think in this way of thinking about it, photography's coldness and its flatness and its syntheticness and its sort of reduction of everything to a homogeneous plane, it does become sort of a membrane. And it becomes a position of like resistance or refusal. And I was really interested in the way that like, I mean, in some ways, photography is really terribly bad at drawing things into our possession. You know, it's like the things are two-dimensional, you can't touch them, they weren't made by touch, you can't approach the digital objects at all. It's like very awkward to put your body in relationship to them. But I think that at the same time, photography is this unique thing that travels both as itself in a material form, like as a print, and also on the internet. Like it's not, if you saw this on the web, it wouldn't be a picture of itself. It would sort of be itself. And so there's like a plasticity or like a language stacks on top of itself with photographs in a way that it wouldn't if these things were executed in another way. So I got really interested in that, in all of the sort of ambiguities, I guess, of the image and the picture and the real and space and these kinds of things. And so I think another way to talk about this, which may be a little more clear, is just to talk about, like, I started to think about what it was that an image doesn't do very well. You know, that if I was going to insist on making pictures and making things that hung on the wall, what is it that the image that travels through space is not approaching, you know? And for me, that turned into this question about efficiency. You know, it's like the thing that the image is really good at is traveling. And the screen is really this super disembodied space. And so I got really interested in what would it mean to use the tools of this very disembodied space and put them in a very bodily relationship. Because the picture, when it hangs on the wall, is really a thing to be addressed with your body, you know? And so I started to see a kind of a counterpoint in the ability to think through these tools that were really, whose native space was in the image and sort of bring them back towards the body. And these are sort of some of those pictures. So I'm going to finish talking, showing just two short projects from very recently. And so thinking about all this body image stuff, I last winter spent a while making photographs of hot dogs. the other one go? And so these pictures, when they're printed, as you can see in that last picture, are quite large. And I was really thinking about these as sort of almost like surrogates for painting. You know, they encourage sort of all of this activity in photography that is not very optic. And they're sort of, for me, they're stand-ins or surrogates, and they sort of act as line and as brushstroke, but they also act as sort of body part and also, you know, are still themselves as still life objects. And so I was interested in all of these sort of contradictory spaces. I mean, I think I really sort of got interested in making pictures that when you saw them, the experience of being in front of them was physical, you know, was bodily. Right. And so this is the last little group. This is a show that's up in Brussels right now called A Farmer's Knowledge. And I don't know, this show is, or this group of works, it's really continuing the things that I've just been talking about. But it's sort of, it's a project that's really, its name is sort of, you know, through sort of a knowing through doing, or an unmediated knowing. And you know, again, it's like photography is this very bad tool for this. So I feel like I'm just sort of pressing up against its skin. Cool. That's all. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to take some questions if anybody has them.
Can you speak at all to how you know when your pictures are done?
Sure. I mean, it's the relationship I was talking to about drawing through, you know, that sometimes they're done when I scan them, you know, and those are easy to know. I feel like if they do get manipulated, there's only so far before it quits acting like a photograph. And so it's sort of a line I'm always holding, and sort of always trying to hold a relationship to the object that's being looked at.
Your influences were all consistent with late period modernist innovation.
Sure.
And I wondered a couple things. Are you not influenced by any female artists? One. And two, are you fundamentally a still life artist and sort of not very interested in the figurative element in painting?
Yes, well, one at a time. There have been a lot of female artists who've been super influential for me. I mean, off the top of my head, a lot of painters, more contemporary painters particularly, Charlene Von Heil and Amy Sillman and Laura Owens are all people I think about a lot. Jan Groover is another one. But I just, yes, no, it's there was another section of artists in this talk at one point that's been sort of abridged. I didn't realize I'd gotten it all down to men. I apologize for that. And no, I am interested in the figure. I think I've just been working out the terms of the work through object relationships. And there are people periodically, I just haven't, I don't know, it's not become the center of the project yet.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi. I'm curious, since you mentioned Jan Groover, and a lot of your photos sort of definitely recall her still lives, and obviously she wasn't using any form of digital manipulation. If it is essential as part of your process that you always incorporate the digital side or Photoshop, or if you're able to achieve something like this, you know, without using Photoshop, if that's sort of okay.
Sure. I mean, I guess the way I think about it is that it's not, I always use, like, even if the photograph has no manipulation, I'm always using Photoshop. Like, every picture I make starts off by shooting 4x5 and then scanning and using Photoshop and outputting. Sometimes what I'm doing in Photoshop is more aggressive than other times. But I feel like that, to me, is just like, it's using the tool to the advantage of the picture, you know? So it's like, I mean, like, this group is not the best to go back through, but a lot of the works, like, that's a straight picture. A lot of the works don't have Photoshop in them, but I think, or not evident Photoshop, but I feel like it's not a, I guess I want to always get it away from a question of purity. You know, it's like, the darkroom had its own ways to give things atmosphere, you know.
This is sort of along that same theme, but I was curious, when you're manipulating your images in Photoshop, particularly the very first image you showed, how much of that manipulation, since with the clone tool, is intentional, and how much is instinctual during that process? Are you, and if it is intentional, what is the criteria that you're using to determine when and where to place those cloned portions?
I mean, the truth is that Photoshop often happens very quickly, you know? It's like, it's pretty gestural. I mean, something like, you know, time, I really want to encourage the work to have some degree of accident in it. You know, like, there's a sort of contingency feeling that happens in photographs that is, I think, really bright and sort of exciting, and it's something that if you work something too much starts to go away, and it's something that I feel like if I'm sort of lighter-handed, I can keep. You know. Well, thank you all very much.
Thank you.